Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the second segment of our Module 3. And as previewed in the program, today we have the interactive session, a questions and answer session. And we have with us our three colleagues from the Trade in Services and Investment Division, Antonia, Rosie, and Martin. So I give you the floor right away. We have 1 hour for this session, so all the best. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. We're waiting for some other colleagues to turn on their camera, and maybe we can start. Yeah, you saw us on Tuesday, and you had heard our presentation. And then this session, we want to hear your views, your comments, your questions. At the end of our presentations, we sort of listed some questions for consideration. They are just indicative. Please feel free to raise any questions you want to you have. And also, if you have some comments or answers to the questions we raised, of course, that would be a great. So maybe just to remind you, questions I put forward at the end of my presentation, you may recall that my presentation focused on shipping disruptions during the pandemic, and also the implications or the trade impacts. And then at the end of my presentation, I invite you to consider what are the factors that lead to the shipping disruptions, and the factors within the maritime transport sector, services, or also outside the maritime sector, and also what lessons could we draw from the impacts of recent shipping disruptions, in particular for maritime transport services, and also is there any role for trade policy and WTO to play to help developing countries mitigate negative impacts of shipping disruptions and resist future shocks. So these are the questions I raised at the end of my presentation. Probably, Antonia, you want to probably remind the participants of your questions. Yes.
Sure, and hello everyone again. It's nice to see those of you that we can see again. Just wanted to follow up to what Rosie was saying. I mean, today's session is really a session where, we are there at your disposal to hear sort of any questions or any doubts or any follow-up that you may want to the presentations we gave on Tuesday. Rosie has reminded you of the questions she had left off with for possible consideration. These are, of course, not the only questions, but on my side, if you remember, I had talked about the digitization of trade in services. And so as broad questions, maybe I can just briefly share my screen to put up the questions that I had suggested might be possible questions for discussion. So issues like what happened to your economy services trade during COVID, and did your government take measures that facilitated the remote supply of services specifically, or any other measures to facilitate trade in services and to better cope with the impact of the crisis? Were there any lessons learned, and what were they? What, in your opinion, would have facilitated greater online supply of services that became so essential to allowing all of our economies to continue functioning during the crisis, and that will be also important in terms of a post-COVID recovery? And here, anything you may want to share in terms of what may be facilitating this trade, both, in terms of domestic initiatives that your own governments could take at the domestic level, but then also more broadly in terms of international cooperation. And then, just a possible area for reflection is what is the role that the WTO could play to help developing countries increase their participation in online services trade. But as I said, these are, just suggestions on our part of possible issues that you may want to discuss or to, you have views or comments on. But we also welcome, any questions on what we presented or on trading services more generally. And feel free to use the chat or raise your hand, whichever way you prefer to interact with us. We're open. So thank you. And just to say that we had a session earlier today with your colleagues. So we're hoping that you beat their record in terms of interaction. So don't be shy, please, ask questions. We always enjoy and we'll try our best to respond. Thank you.
And also want to add, we also have our colleague Martin there, and he is also available to answer your questions about, overall picture of the impact of COVID on trading services, and also any sectors you are interested. He's able to answer all your questions.
Yes, very, very nice. Thank you, Rosie. But maybe we can start. I think we'll take any of your questions or comments to kick this off. You already had a lot of questions listed by Antonia and Rosie. One thing that came out this morning that we discussed was there were some questions about WTO discussions on the response to the pandemic in view of the MC12. So we can also discuss that further as you wish. So the floor is open, as we say here.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for breaking the ice, as it were. I think it's very helpful to us that, someone takes the plunge. Otherwise, we might have to start asking each other questions. So really appreciate you having a go at this. And I don't think at this stage there's really any need to be a GATT specialist, although, of course, we focused on the area that we deal with in the WTO. I think our idea was really to have a broader discussion. And I think your question is an interesting question, that you have a sense, and I think it's correct, that there is some reluctance on the part of some developing countries, certainly, to negotiate or to join this joint statement initiative on electronic commerce. So maybe, I think your sense is correct to the extent that there is certainly some reluctance on the part of, maybe I'll distinguish a little bit. There's reluctance on the part of some members to the whole process of joint statement initiatives. So this number of negotiating efforts that involve only a subset of WTO members. So there are some members that are not in favor and object to some subsets of WTO members engaging in this plurilateral initiative. So it's not necessarily something specific to the JSI on e-commerce, but it's more of a horizontal concern, if I can call it that. And then there is some, maybe, but there is some concern possibly in terms of joining specifically the one on electronic commerce, although, you know, there hasn't really been, to be fair, a discussion of specific issues with regard to that initiative. Some of the concerns are more broad, are horizontal. When it comes to the initiative on the joint statement, when it comes to the joint statement initiative on electronic commerce, what we have heard by way of member statements specifically related to e-commerce is that some say that the development of rules when it comes to electronic commerce is premature. So there are already, the WTO agreements already apply to electronic commerce, but the proponents or the main drivers behind the JSI on e-commerce is that they feel that these rules maybe need to be complemented by additional rules or need to be upgraded or somehow clarified. So they're pushing to enlarge the rule book, as it were. And some of the reluctance has been expressed by some developing countries that say, well, we think that's premature because not all members have the same opportunities to take part in digital trade or, you know, services traded electronically in the specific case of services. And we think that if we had rules that further facilitated this trade, because that's what many of these, the objective of this proposed new discipline, their main objective is to further facilitate electronic commerce and trade through electronic means, that this would further exacerbate this divide in terms of participation in digital trade more generally. So that's sort of the, you know, the statement and the reasoning that has been explicitly mentioned as to why the joint statement initiative is perceived to be something that may not necessarily be in every member's interest. At the same time, I would just note that, you know, at the moment there are 86 participants in the joint statement initiative, and many of them are actually developing countries. And some are, I'm just trying to go through the list here, but some are also least developed countries. So it's not a feeling that is necessarily shared, you know, across the board by all developing countries in the WTO, but it's certainly something, some concerns that have been raised on the part of a number of developing countries. So I hope that answers part of your question at least. Thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to look at the questions, maybe. Okay, there's a second question. I seem to be on the spot for now. So there's a question about, I'm curious from, I cannot read the full name, but I'm curious to know more details about the debate on the e-commerce moratorium. So maybe I can take that question and then see if my colleagues want to add with regard to the other questions. I haven't looked at them yet. But so thank you for that question. I mean, I think, again, there's maybe two different levels of debate going on. So when I take the e-commerce moratorium is an issue that is mainly discussed under the aegis of the General Council. So there are 4 bodies in the WTO that are also mandated with discussing that issue, including the Council for Trade and Services, also Council for Trade in Goods, Council for TRIPS, and Committee on Trade and Development. But the issue is actually discussed much more focused, in a much more focused manner, more detailed manner under the General Council. So in that context, there are essentially 3 main issues that are the object of the discussion, specifically on the moratorium. One, where views of members differ. One is with regard to the scope of the moratorium. So some members are of the view that the moratorium only covers the transmission. So the moratorium is a moratorium on the application of customs duties to electronic transmissions. And some members are of the view that that moratorium, so that non-application of customs duties, only concerns the transmission and does not include the content that is being transmitted. So that's one first element of discussion. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of WTO members are not of that view. They consider the moratorium also to apply to the content that is being transmitted. The second issue that has emerged fairly recently, in recent months, I would say, probably since the last decision on the ministerial, which was in 2007, on the moratorium, sorry, which was in 2017, is whether the moratorium also applies to services trade, which for us, of course, it's, for us as services people, it's a very significant question. And there, again, the views are different. Some members say that it doesn't apply to services because customs duties are not generally barriers that one encounters when trading services. But again, I think the vast majority of members are of the view that there is no distinction in the way the moratorium is drafted that would suggest that services would not be covered by the scope of the moratorium. It is still, having said that, it is a fact that when it comes to trading services, customs duties are not generally the most significant or very widespread type of restriction. There are other restrictions, but the moratorium would nevertheless imply that governments would not apply customs duties to services transmitted electronically. And finally, the last issue that is being discussed when it comes, as far as the moratorium is concerned, is about its implications. So clearly the fact that WTO members so far have agreed not to impose customs duties on electronic transmission implies that some customs revenue is lost because you're no longer applying duties to products that used to be goods like movies or magazines or books or music that used to be transmitted through a physical medium like a cassette, a DVD player, or just a physical book, and now are transmitted electronically, and so no longer have a physical equivalent on which duties are applied. So there is undoubtedly a loss of customs revenue. The discussion in the WTO on that particular issue is first, how do we calculate that loss? So to some extent, this goes back to the scope of the moratorium. Does it include the content? Because if it includes the content, then you have customs implications. If not, you have none, because nobody, no member imposes duties on the transmission itself, on the bits and bytes, so far at least. And then other element of discussion is whether, focusing narrowly only on the fiscal revenue implications in terms of the customs duties that you no longer collect is the right sort of benchmark to look at when we're looking at the effects of the moratorium, because some members argue that actually we should take a broader view, and when you look at trade liberalization, generally you just don't focus only on the fact that you're going to be losing customs revenue, but you look much more broadly at what are the impacts in terms of consumer welfare, in terms of greater access, greater choice, higher quality, lower prices. So those are, I would say, maybe the three main issues that are being discussed with regard to the moratorium, which is presently in force until the next ministerial conference, which is presently scheduled for the week of 13 June. So for the time being, members will continue, are continuously, have agreed to continue the moratorium. Its fate, whether it will be renewed, will be decided at MC12. And then maybe one last point to add in that context is that the discussion of the moratorium is one and probably the key issue on which views differ, but there is also a linkage that has been made with the wider discussions under the work program, where some delegations are essentially linking the fate of the moratorium with the fate of the work program. So the ones who would like to see the moratorium renewed would also would require that as a precondition to continue also with the work program. They're saying if there's no moratorium, there will be also no work program under which discussions are taking place in the WTO on electronic commerce. So I think this, it's broad overview of the discussions that are presently taking place. They're not taking place in the Council for Trade and Services specifically, but they're taking place in the General Council because of the horizontal implications of the moratorium. But I'm happy to take any follow-up questions. But thanks. And I'll go back to reading other questions.
Okay, should we move to some of the other questions? Maybe I can read some of them out. So the other one is, are there any cases of nearshoring in services sectors or countries in the BPO or ITO scaling back? Guatemala did not, well, I guess there are many questions in that. So let's start with that. Well, it's hard to say because, I mean, we don't, or at least I have not seen data that would try to capture this very specifically. But one of the things we saw during the pandemic was an increase in the number of services trade in sectors like computer services, business services, so different types of services that could be delivered digitally. So I suspect there has not been a very significant scaling back of these types of operations. Of course, a lot of company operations, domestically, internationally, were disrupted, by a slowdown of demand and other issues. So of course that can have affected a lot of these operations, but certainly I don't remember having seen restrictions, for example, or measures of government that would have slowed this down. So most likely, if anything, this particular types of cross-border operations may have been facilitated. So there was, of course, in some countries, a push to bring back, the supply chains or secure them and so on. But I'm not sure that this call was really focusing on business process outsourcing. In particular. Then the second part of the question, so Guatemala did not specify any support to the services sectors. This was more, I guess, broad-based. So what examples could have been given? Well, when we looked, we tried to monitor the types of measures taken during the pandemic that affected trade and services. We saw different things in different sectors, and it's true that in the case of services, there was very few, market access measures that were introduced or that were relaxed. It was more, general domestic regulation type measures that would affect different types of sectors. For example, of course, in telecommunication, many measures were taken to facilitate the supply of telecommunication networks, to facilitate the expansion of capacity, to facilitate some of the licensing issues there. In health services, some countries relaxed some of the procedures in place so as to make it easier to provide health services online. Before, you had a number of procedures and requirements that you had to meet, and of course, in the face of the crisis, then that was relaxed. So it's not a measure that is focused on the international trade of such services, but it has an impact on trade also. Measures to facilitate also financial services, e-payments, and things like that. So there's a lot of measures like that were taken that were not aimed at, first and foremost, necessarily to facilitate trade in services, but that clearly also had an impact on trade and services. We saw, like I said, in the presentation, there were some measures, some restrictive measures that were taken. So this is not an example I'm giving to Guatemala, but there's some foreign investment restrictions that were, or some foreign investment tightening that was done by a number of countries. And there were some cases, I think in the Middle East in particular, there were some countries there that had some trade restrictions on voice over IP services, so Skype and these kinds of things that were restricted. And so they did, of course, in response to the crisis, decide to liberalize these services and liberalize the supply cross-border and also domestically. So this is one example of a clearly trade-centered measure. And the next question, I just heard that there has been some discussions on the trade and health initiatives this morning. Just wish to know what was discussed. So I thought when I first read this, I thought you meant that there had been discussions in the WTO about this. So I was a bit surprised because I didn't know about it, but I guess you're referring to our own internal discussion. And there was, well, maybe I can just maybe see if that sparks some kind of a reaction. I can just show you on the screen. So this is what I had in the slide earlier on, and so the question this morning was more about, you know, what is the status, what is being discussed, and where are we at, and so this is what I had mentioned on Tuesday, that in the WTO there was at the end of last year, in view of MC12, a discussion on a ministerial declaration on the organization's response to the pandemic. This had been discussed by members for many months last year, and of course it was not finalized or concluded. So this, but the expectation was that ministers would discuss this and hopefully agree to a ministerial declaration, which is a political declaration that would have, you know, issued statements on, you know, I guess lessons learned to some extent and key messages in relation to the pandemic from a trade and WTO perspective, and, you know, key issues in that regard related, of course, to export restrictions. So you had a number of countries calling for restraint to be used during the pandemic in using export restrictions for medical goods, about transparency in the use of export restrictions, about the importance of you know, complying with the monitoring or the notification requirements, and so on. So many topics discussed from a trade perspective, and then you had services that was addressed, and then you see the latest draft again, which is just not agreed, but the latest draft of that ministerial declaration as it relates to services. And I guess, you know, we can also ask you the question, you know, looking at this draft, which of course is short, but, you know, you can't expect ministers to issue very extensive statements on services. They haven't done that for like 15 years. So still, you know, looking at that, is there anything you think that is missing there, or that you do not think maybe should be there in light of the discussion that we had about the impact, about the role of services in the recovery? Is that the kind of political message that makes sense to you or not? So I'll leave that to you as in response to your question as an additional question. And now the status of this, and there was also a discussion this morning, what is the status of these discussions? Well, of course, the discussions ended more or less in with the postponement of MC12 last year. There has been some attempt to revive the discussions this year. In January, February, I think we actually went probably backwards. So there was a pause that was called on these discussions for people to rethink and assess, what they actually wanted to do and how best to take this work forward. And then, sorry, I see there's kind of I guess a follow-up to what I was just saying. Is there any binding commitment in the text? No, certainly not, because this is the whole purpose of this is to have a political declaration. So it is meant, and I think the text itself says that it is not intended to have a politically binding character. It's just that it is a ministerial declaration, so there would be at MC12 ideally a ministerial declaration where ministers would talk about a number of topics that are relevant for the WTO. But given the key impact of the pandemic, there was a desire by many members to have a kind of a dedicated declaration that would focus on the pandemic and the trade related issues with that. So effective, as effective as a political declaration can be, but it doesn't mean that it is irrelevant, because this is what ministerial conferences are for. It's not only to have results of negotiations and things like that. It's also for ministers to provide a bit of guidance and take stock of what has been done. And so even though it is not legally binding and legally enforceable, it can still have value, not only to terms of having a common response to the pandemic from a trade perspective, but also in terms of guiding future discussions and future work on that, because part of that outcome would be also to have a plan for future work or future discussions, so as to help better prepare the organization to better respond to future pandemics. So in a way, to not forget what we went through, but to reflect, discuss, share best practices, make sure that we can respond in a better way and be more resilient to such future crises when they come around next time. Yes, indeed. So the draft action plan as a more concrete guidance. Of course, this is still a draft. Things can change, and it will be up to members to further discuss and make sure that it something that is useful can come out. But the idea indeed is not only to have some kind of a response and then we forget all about this, but to have a plan to help guide future discussions in the different committees and the General Council and so on, so that we can learn and see if something needs to be changed in the rules or the practices of the organization in the future, so that we don't repeat past mistakes and we encourage the best practices that were followed in services and in other ways. So I see there's a question on statistics. I don't know if Rosie or Antonia, you want to address that one, or I carry on.
We are not statisticians. We are not experts. I think we can pass on your question to our colleagues specialized in trading services statistics. Just one information, yes, now I think our colleagues, I think it's very recent, they built up trading service statistics modes of supply, but how they do that and their methodology, and also to respond to your question, how to improve data collection, I think it's better for our colleagues working on trading services statistics for them to answer your question. So we are going to pass on your question to our statisticians. Sorry for that.
That's perfect answer. But I mean, just to say, because I mean, we're kind of confronted with the same problem, because I mean, there was a lot of improvement in services trade statistics, you know, over the last years, but still they're not at the same level as statistics for trade in goods. They don't come out also as quickly as for trade in goods. So we had to wait, you know, to understand the impact of the pandemic, for example, on services trade. We had to wait, you know, for these statistics to be published. It took a bit more time than for goods. So we had to, this is why we all had to look at our different sectors and transport and otherwise to look at more anecdotal data to try to understand the impact on trade, because it took some time before we could get the trade statistics. And for mode 3, which is mentioned in the question, it is true that I think we still don't know. I still haven't seen anything that would show, you know, in a very comprehensive manner, the impact of the pandemic on trade under mode 3, because we don't have very extensive data for many countries for that. We know the impact of the pandemic on foreign direct investment, but it's not quite the same thing.
And maybe just to complement what my colleagues have said, and not to offer an answer, because I think, yeah, it's the best place to pass on the question is to our statisticians. But maybe just to complement the fact that they've done a lot of work precisely because of these data difficulties that Rosie and Martin were talking about, and that you were highlighting also in terms of collecting data, particularly for services traded through mode 3, establishment of a commercial presence, is that in a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, they released a new data set. This is what Rosie was alluding to, which is called TISMOS, Trading Services by Mode of Supply, which for the first time allowed us to have a sense for the entirety of trading services, because we were always missing the part accounted for by mode 3 in particular. And I understand there's an update that's going to be released, or that's in the making for this year. But I also understand, but this is all to be checked with our statisticians, colleagues, that a significant part of that data set is based on estimates. So there's a number of assumptions that are made about certain sectors, services sectors being more likely to be traded through certain modes than others. And so in this sense, as Martin was saying, we may not immediately be able to see from that data the impact, for instance, on the pandemic, because certain assumptions may not have been changed to reflect what has happened in the pandemic. So that's a limitation that we still face with trading services in terms of measurement. To a large extent, it reflects the fact that, you know, the invisibility of services that are not traded by going through a customs office where, you know, trade can be clearly documented and measured. And as the colleague from Bangladesh was saying, indeed, you know, most of the trading services measurement comes from the balance of payment, which of course takes into account services traded through modes 1, 2, and 4, but misses a big part, mode 3, which has actually been estimated to account for about half of all services trade. So we only have a partial picture, but in terms of how to remedy that and what practical steps can be taken to improve the overall picture, I think, yeah, we will definitely pass on the question to our statistics colleague, as Rosie was saying, and they'll be able to provide a much more comprehensive and effective answer than the one we can. Thank you. You are all doing very well. You are doing much better than your colleagues this morning. So can we prompt you to ask more questions or just comments? We don't necessarily, if you can't think of anything to ask us, we'd be very happy to hear, your views, your thoughts. We've, talked about how something we deal with on a daily basis, which is, trade in services. Of course, your expertise may be in other areas, but I think, that's a challenge that over the last 2 years we have all faced in one shape or form. So we'd be happy to hear your comments, thoughts, and any other questions you can think of. Okay, so I just saw a question, very interesting question, a very difficult question. So the question is, do you think there will be an agreement with a global discussion of who owns data? To be honest, I don't know. That's the short answer. I don't have an answer to that. I think it's an extremely topical issue, if you want to call it that. In the terms of the discussions that members are having in the WTO, and essentially under the joint statement initiative discussions, the ownership of data hasn't emerged as an issue where disciplines are being proposed. What has emerged so far are suggestions or proposals, more like it, to for members not to impose restrictions on the cross-border flow of data. So it's not so much about who owns it, but about governments not imposing barriers to the cross-border flow of data, except, as for any higher legitimate public policy objective that are being proposed. But the discussion of the ownership of data hasn't really taken place in the WTO so far. So there, I really wouldn't know how the prospects for an agreement may look like. It's from the current discussions, I would say probably not going to be happening in the WTO, because at least so far there haven't been any proposals in this sense. But thanks for the question. So there's another question. How does the WTO help developing LDCs increase online services trade, specifically health services, given the pandemic? And do you have an update on TRIPS issue with regard to the development of supply of vaccines? Maybe I can try to, to address some of that question and see if my colleagues want to complement it. I think with regard to the first part of the question, in terms of how does the WTO help developing LDCs increase online services trade specifically, maybe, I don't know to what extent this is something that has been discussed in the context of the response to the pandemic, but when it comes at least to, so the short answer is there is nothing specifically on that focused on health services trade. Of course, this is an area that has emerged as an important area in terms of dealing with a situation like the one we've been facing. And online trade in health services is something that, as Martin was saying earlier, we've seen some governments take measures to facilitate broadly, but as far as I know, this is not something that has been targeted particularly at developing countries or LDCs, exports of these services, but I'll leave Martin to complement that. I just wanted to make a brief reference to the fact that when it comes to LDCs, there has been an agreement that was reached in 2011 for a waiver mechanism to provide more favorable treatment to services and services suppliers of LDCs. So under that instrument, there have been 25 notifications of preferences that a number of mainly developed, but also some big developing countries have given to try to facilitate services exports from LDCs services suppliers. So although there is nothing that I can think of off the top of my head that's specifically targeted at health services, there have been, there was a mechanism to try and, as part of a broader effort to increase the participation of LDCs in global services trade. But I'll see whether my colleagues have something to add on this.
Yeah, I mean, on the health services, I mean, it did come up a little bit in the discussion on the response to the pandemic, but not extensively. And if you actually look at the current draft, you see at the end of the first paragraph, there was, and if it's there, it's if there's a mention, it's because some members wanted to have that reference, of course. So, we also acknowledge the importance of facilitating trade and services, including health services and ICT services. So you see here the perfect negotiating balance, between, one group wanting a reference to health, and then the other group wants reference to another sector to compensate. But so there are some countries that wanted the reference to the importance of facilitating health services, but frankly, I'm not sure exactly that it was a very broadly acknowledged issue. That the role of trade and for health services, whether movement of health workers or online health services, it was not discussed very extensively, because of course all countries are mostly concerned with their own ability to be able to provide for health services to their own population. So I don't think there has been a whole lot of a widespread discussion of the role of trade in further boosting that, if not the other way, the opposite rather. But so that's what I would say with respect to that question. And on TRIPS, indeed, as Danielle mentioned, there is a different module that will focus on that. So you will be able to ask all the questions you want on the TRIPS waiver. Of course, the TRIPS waiver discussion are ongoing. Not sure there's any big development right now with respect to that, but it is an issue that has been linked to the political declaration on the response to the pandemic. It's a different issue somewhat, but of course in practice it is linked, and in terms of negotiation, because everything here is a negotiation, it is very much linked together, but certainly not my expertise. I know nothing about TRIPS per se.
Maybe
so,
I can move on.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Martin, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to read the other questions, but I haven't done so please go ahead. Okay.
So not to add anything on TRIPS, I know just, what the acronym stands for, and that's about it. So I'm definitely not going to get an answer from me on that. But I think there is a question about a global tax for services. And some services, So I think I'm wondering if this question refers to digital services taxes more specifically. So I can maybe say something on that, but if I'm off the tangent, maybe stop me. Digital, yeah, okay. So maybe just a couple of things on this issue. I think this is essentially a question, if I understand correctly, that refers to the discussion that has taken place mainly in the OECD under the BEPS discussions there, and that is linked to the imposition by a number of WTO members of so-called digital services taxes. So I think the unfortunate thing is that the way these taxes are called gives the impression that they are service taxes imposed on the individual sector service, but instead, actually, in most instances, these taxes are taxes on the income of services firms that sell digital services. So they're not necessarily service taxes on the service itself, it's more a tax on the service supplier. So these were taxes that were imposed by a number of members that, and some of them are still in force or being imposed or being looked at, and some have been suspended, or their application is on, under consideration while the process in the OECD is going on. So with regard to these taxes, there was a feeling, a sense in a number of countries that, as the question also alludes to, a lot of services revenue is earned by companies in markets where they don't have a physical presence, and therefore they escape the tax authorities, so to speak, in very simple terms. And so a number of members have introduced digital services taxes on services sales on the part of companies that have a certain threshold, so big companies. And this has, it's particularly affected US companies, not only, but mainly US companies who are big, suppliers of digital services. At the same time, the OECD has been discussing for a number of years a system to look at profit shifting and tax base erosion and profit shifting to come to an agreement as to how to address partly also these issues. The OECD came to an agreement at the end of last year under 2 pillars, and I won't bore you with the details. But so as a result of this, there had been an investigation on the part of USTR in particular in these digital services taxes. But these the agreement under the OECD framework is that for the time being, this thing is put on the back burner pending the entry into force of the agreement at the OECD. So for the time being, this is not an issue that's being discussed in the WTO as such, but it's an issue that, of course, may have relevance, particularly for trade in services. But at this stage, the issue is in the hands of the OECD, and in terms of the OECD members, and more broadly than the OECD members, I think there's 137 economies that are part of that discussion. So it's much wider than the OECD membership. They're trying to sort out this issue under that framework. Once that is entered into force, these digital services taxes will most likely be removed. So it's too early to tell. It's work in progress to a large extent, and I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe I can also try to address briefly, I see the clock is running, about the WTO have any suggestions on how to remove these inequalities, to take advantage of digital trade. And I think, well, suggestions, I don't know, I mean, as WTO Secretariat, we wouldn't venture any suggestion, but I think in terms of discussion, you know, of course, these inequalities in terms of participation in digital trade, in terms of size of firm, rural population, you know, certain parts of the population that maybe are less involved in digital trade are, you know, they exist amongst members, but also within members. At the domestic level, it's, you know, it's difficult to see what role the WTO may have, other than to maybe facilitate, you know, access to digital technologies, for instance, by you know, facilitating binding commitments that liberalize further some underlying backbone services, such as telecommunication services. I don't know if my colleagues want to add something, but looking at the other questions.
I think I will just very briefly, I think we are running out of time, just to complement. One is the relevance of WTO for the issue of digital service tax. Just to let you know that the US initiated 301 section investigation against 10 WTO members. And then they concluded, I think, on 4 or 5. And then so if based on the US, their legal procedures, these members are, according to the United States, their digital tax, their service tax are inconsistent with WTO MFN. And also some even inconsistent with their gas commitments. But then there's no procedures in the WTO, but just want to give you one example, just to say that there is WTO relevance there. Some legal actions are ongoing. And then there's one question here about service classification. I think it's very complicated to answer that question, because you mentioned this IoT, virtual reality, augmented reality, all this AI, whether they are in the service classification. If you look at literal, you know, literally, you may not find them in the classification, okay? But then the problem is that how you want to, you know, interpret the heading of the service classification, and how you determine whether a service falls under the existing service classification is very complicated. This is very challenging question, and then so I don't think that you know, we can give a sort of a clear answer to that, because in the committee on specific commitments in the past few years, members tried to clarify and also tried to find a solution, something like, you know, to work on case-by-case basis, to work on specific service, but then at the end, there was no sort of conclusion on that issue. So this is just maybe it's not very, it's not a satisfactory answer, but that is very complicated.
Thank you very much. I believe we are reaching our 1 hour mark. I just wanted to also acknowledge one comment made by Ravi, who mentioned that COVID-19 is an eye-opener for many countries on the importance of global supply chains and the importance of international trade in addressing crises like COVID-19, and that in Malaysia, many new measures and initiatives are looking at this, of how these disruptions to supply chains could be minimized in tackling future crises. So just to acknowledge that comment as well. I thank you all very much for the engagement, all the good discussion, for your questions and answers. Thank you to all the participants for this active participation, and to our trainers for being with us on Tuesday and today. to take the questions. Just to let you know that the recordings of this session and the morning session are being converted into video, and they will be provided to you via link. We links, in fact. We hope to send those links to you before tomorrow morning. In that email, we will also attach a paper that Antonia referred to this morning, and we also put that paper into the Google Drive, as well as we will attach a flyer with information about tomorrow's roundtable and short biographies of our distinguished speakers. So you can have a look of who will be at tomorrow's roundtable. And I definitely would like to encourage you to join us tomorrow at 13:30, that is 1:30 p.m. in Geneva. There will be only one session tomorrow, a live roundtable discussion. And that roundtable is aimed at senior WTO experts and services negotiators to share their insights with you on how the WTO could address important services trade policy issues. And you will be able to also engage with those speakers through a Q&A session. So I invite you to join us tomorrow at 1:30, 13:30 Geneva time. And we will close for today. I see some messages, but I suppose perhaps they are just closing messages of thank yous, which I would like to echo again. Many thanks to all of you, and see you tomorrow.